It's an open mic, so anyone who wants to speak can speak. But presumably you have questions for
and
us.
Kevin, if I could just say, I've made my travel arrangements based on the original timings. So if anyone's got any questions for me, if you can make them now, because I actually have to leave in 10 minutes.
Yes, the dictator says Tina goes first. So
Thank
questions
you.
for Tina first.
I thought you might have a few. Yes.
Hi, that was great to hear you talk. My understanding is what you said is in the dual use space,
yes,
which covers, there are so many thousand areas of science, even if it only covers 10 or 5%, it's still a fair bit. I mean, particularly, if I want to investigate high quality stuff, like computers that operate at a wide range of temperatures, or visual material, visual tools that are very accurate, or something like that. It seems to cover a fair bit.
And it is. You're right. It's about the thresholds in the DSGL.
Yeah. So I want to be creative. Imagine, I mean, this isn't my field, but imagine I wanted to be really, really creative and get out there and do absolutely advanced research and discover new things.
Yes.
All I have to do now, in the past I'd just do it, and all I have to do now is go to the military, the military, and say, hey, I want to do creative research. Will you give me a permit to be creative? Now, I'm just thinking self-censorship is, how do you understand, or what role do you see, what the mechanism is that you're going to use to prevent self-censorship? Because otherwise, if people self-censor themselves, control what they want to think about, then Australia isn't creative anymore.
So what we're doing is asking you to tell us what you're thinking about or wanting to think about.
1984 flashes in my mind.
Okay, well, I can assure you that we currently at the moment actually consider 5,000 applications a year, with industry, defence industry, very high-tech companies sharing their technology with us, 5,000 applications every year. And we haven't had any concerns that you raise.
It's military or dual use?
That's military.
Both. No, at the moment it's dual use and military, because under the DSGL at the moment, if you're physically exporting any of this stuff, you're coming to us with the specifications, and our technical advisors, and of course I'm not one, we probably picked that, our technical advisors assess what's in there, and we go across government, because our technical advisors are generalists, they're scientists in general areas, but they'll go to the Australian Signals Directorate, they'll go to ANSTO, they'll go to the Department of Health. They'll go out and they'll actually work out, first of all, whether what you're wanting to do or wanting to send overseas is controlled. That's the first thing. So that information is being shared with us already. This is not new.
But that's optionally. That's now compulsory.
No, at the moment, if somebody's sending something physically overseas...
No, I'm talking about ideas. I'm talking about creative.
The intangible stuff is all new. She's talking about physically
But
transmitting.
what I'm saying is, I'm trying to, but yes, you will be coming to us and we'll be working with you, and at the very formative stages, at the very initial stages when your ideas aren't necessarily that formed, it may be that we say to you, look, at the moment, we don't see any concern. Come back to us at a further stage of your research and have a talk to us again when you're further down your research path.
Have you had any historians of technology in this process? Because I've never heard of, there's nowhere in the history of the sciences that I've heard of that sort of system not dampening creativity.
Okay, well, and I think it will be a learning process for us as well, because we're at the moment, we will start on the 16th of May to be, for people who are forward thinking and coming to us, we will be looking at those applications and assessing them.
If I can take a different take, I mean, going to Deco before you have an idea of what your idea might be is it's not going to be particularly useful in reality.
So can I ask about ARC projects then? Because you have to go to the ARC when your ideas are not yet so particular that they're obvious.
But one of the things that we're working on is institutional frameworks and organisational frameworks, and looking at undertaking an assessment of concepts and where things might go, and if something's, you're working in a particular area, so you do an evaluation against the DSGL to identify whether or not you whether or not you captured. Now the reality is that quite often you may not be controlled, but what you need to do is then understand, well, at what threshold might I be controlled? What are some of the aspects that might result in me being captured? And we'll be looking at, through these frameworks, encouraging people to undertake have almost a risk management plan, so that, what are some of the key factors that they need to bear in mind as they're progressing things. So if you're just developing ideas, whatever area you might be in, having you think about, okay, what are the thresholds in the DSGL, and at what point might I have to go and reconsider what I'm doing, or approach DECO. So there's some of the things that we're looking at within the organisational frameworks that we're developing with, in conjunction with Curtin, UQ, QIMR and the like.
Yeah.
I had a question there in relation to, like, I work with industry and I help industry find researchers and scientists to solve problems. I work for some of the government programs. I just spent last year working with the Melbourne Research Office and Melbourne Commercial, so I've got a good, the ARC question is a very good one. Question there is, how do international companies like Thales, Boeing, Siemens, who hold their data, who are operating in Australia, but hold their data in overseas storage, and much cloud data is cloud, what designates the definition of a transfer outside Australia when you're using cloud-based computing, or you've got international companies in Australia who are storing their data overseas, but the activities are happening here?
Are we talking in the brokering space?
No, I'm just talking about in transfer, in Australia, or transferring things overseas. What about the cloud?
It's the way that it's transferred is not a concept that's in the legislation. It's the sender, the location of the sender, and the location of the recipient.
So it could be anywhere, but in the international World Wide Web, it could have gone all over the place.
So one of the issues is that if it's about transferring to an individual. So if you're transferring to a cloud server that might be based in China in reality, that's not subject to control, is how I understand it.
That's true. It's where the recipient is.
So what about a company like Siemens, Thales, Boeing, anyone working on international servers? Those people don't have any home identified in their internet addresses. They're basically in the domain of their corporate identity.
But where is the recipient located?
So it's where they're physically sitting, is it?
Yes.
At what given time? Some people work, some of the people I deal with work in Germany 2 or 3 weeks, and then they work here for another couple of weeks, working in America for another few. They're not located anywhere. They're on planes crossing the oceans half the time, like a lot of academics are.
I believe we all know by now that US companies can be tasked to hand over information to the US government without warning and without any publicity. So if you back up to Google Drive, isn't that a violation of DTCA?
No.
Sorry? Well, it becomes a violation when they turn that information over to the US government?
Sorry, are you talking about somebody in Australia sending something to somebody overseas?
No, I back it up on Google Drive, and Google gets an order from the FBI and turns it over, all that information over to the FBI. The FBI now has all that information.
Did you intend to send it to the FBI in the US?
No.
Then it's not an offence.
Well, what if I send something to someone, they've flown overseas and they've received it overseas?
Yes, there was
how do I meant to know where to send it?
There was an issue raised about that. There was an amendment, a further amendment mooted, and I don't know what the official response to it is, that if you're communicating with an Australian permanent resident and they happen to be overseas, that should be exempted.
Some of this falls under, in the multinationals, it comes under the definition of actually what is a person, because a person relates to what is an organisation. So if you're a multinational organisation and you're sending it to somebody else in the same organisation, it's actually the same person. So you're not offending the legislation because it's like a person sending it to themselves. So that's not captured under the legislation.
Can we agree there are still some points to be resolved in the
And
legislation?
the FAQs will cover that. So what I'd suggest is if you have a look at that particular question on multinationals in particular, there's an actual FAQ that'll come up on the website specifically on that point. Have a read of that and then come back to us with any further questions, because those FAQs will be constantly updated. They're just a starting point. And as the questions come, we will update those FAQs and provide more guidance, and we'll also start looking at areas that we need to look at in the review.
So the review is ongoing, by the way. The Chubb group is continuing to sit for the next year at least.
Absolutely.
Hopefully longer.
Sorry, I did skip that slide.
And they will possibly be proposing new amendments. So that's part of the point for my pitch, that we can encourage or even force them to propose more sensible amendments.
And absolutely, and I really encourage you to ask all of those questions. And I am sorry, but I have to go. But the DECO website, there's come to us with those questions, and we will make sure that our FAQs address your issues, okay, or we will respond to you directly by an email.
Okay, the FAQ does not have the force of law, nor do the explanatory memoranda. The law needs to change to have the force
Sorry,
of law.
there was one more question.
Yeah, I'm just curious to know why the exemption in the UK is not considered. The exemption that exempts the academia.
Why not just adopt the UK word?
Why? I want to know the main argument why it is not considered.
Well, it was looked at. And if you speak to the UK about how their actual regulations are enforced, they're very similar to the way. That's a statement of intent, but the way the UK legislation actually works on a day-to-day basis is very similar to what will be enforced here.
In other words, we should have adopted that word. Because it wouldn't change the way you enforce anything. It would just protect researchers.
So yes.
I like that answer.
What will be the cost of compliance to institutions in the private sector over the next 10 years?
Would you like to?
So, as part of the pilot program, with Curtin University and University of Queensland involved, the discussions that I've had with both of them. So for University of Queensland, they're expecting that they'll require 2 compliance officers in the short term, particularly as compliance arrangements are initially established. Thanks, Tina.
Sorry, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
In the case of Curtin University, they're probably looking at less than 0.5 of an FTE to manage its compliance. UQ will likely establish, and I'm using these examples, but they're a long way down the track, so they may or may not do this, but UQ would likely have a dedicated body to oversee compliance, or a dedicated committee overseeing it. Curtin believes that it can manage its compliance within its existing arrangements and processes with minimal intervention.
I'm just wondering if there was an actual analysis done and an estimate made, and whether the process of coming up with this felt any accountability to the impact on the broad commercial picture.
There actually was
the regulatory impact.
The regulatory impact
statement goes to it.
That was done. It has been forensically analysed by a colleague, and his assessment was on good grounds that it was full of mistakes and wasn't really particularly either rigorous or thorough.
Yeah, it appeared to be a kind of cookie-cutter approach that just applied a uniform number to all organizations, and then they didn't estimate the number of organizations affected in any appropriate way. Just 100 high-tech companies.
Can I clarify that point as well? To the best of my knowledge, Ian Chubb has never referred to 100 high-tech companies being affected.
Well, I'll go get the quote and send it to you, because I know I read it.
Yeah, I certainly I certainly
Well,
don't recall. That's all I'm
Well,
suggesting.
it's in the tables showing how much of an impact there would be of the regulation on industry.
Sorry, in the RIS?
It's in one of the documents related to the legislation. I can't.
Okay.
I don't think it's the guide. Maybe the final explanatory memorandum.
Well, I understand they're government documents developed by Department of Defence.
Okay, so
Ian.
not Chubb. Fine. Okay, I take that back. It was somebody. It was somebody.
Ian doesn't clear defence as a RIS.
Yeah.
Or the,
I also add the Australian Technology Showcase is not a government compliant list.
Of course not. No, I went to that in response to this statement that 100 companies would be affected.
You have to pay to get on the list.
Oh, okay.
No, still.
All right, but that just means it's an underestimate of the impact. So, bottom line is, whoever was doing that estimate, I apologize to Mr. Chubb. Whoever was doing that estimate was doing it in a very crude fashion.
I believe it was a legal officer in Defence Legal. But anyhow, on this issue of compliance costs and costs, I've had a fair amount of exposure to US ITAR because I've collaborated with a lot of people in the US who've had ITAR controls on them, especially in the military sector. Some observations here. What we do know empirically over the last 20 years of ITAR operation is that the cost of US military equipment is roughly 30% higher than the cost of military equipment that is manufactured and marketed by EU nations, Israel and other nations at the same technology level. In other words, you buy an American rifle or a missile, you get the equivalent product from Europe or Israel or any other country, you pay 30% more for the US stuff. Our think tank looked at this problem some time ago. We posed the question, well, let's say we just had ITAR in this country, okay? When we crunched the numbers and looked at some of the double handling and administrative overheads, but also security overheads, need to firewall things, need to have network security, need to have physical access security, you basically ended up, that's where the extra 30% of cost was coming from. Now, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics has been very unhappy about the impacts of ITAR in the United States on their cost structures. The classic figure that they quote, and we put that into, if you've seen the EPAR Australia parliamentary submission, the one we did February 2013, and you have a look at that. One of the case studies they use is the space launch market. It was regulated fairly loosely under dual use initially. Later it got pushed into the military domain, far more rigorous controls. They had 85% of the world's share of commercial satellite launches. Now they are 15%. Now there are other impacting factors in there, which was Chinese competition, Russian competition, Ukrainian competition, and of course the Europeans with the French-led space program in Europe. Nevertheless, this is the difference. The fact that they were, what's happened is there's a whole global industry of marketing ITAR-free dual-use and military products. In other words, and that's become a major selling pitch issue when people compete against American products. Okay, so you've got ITAR, you've got all of this administrative baggage, and we can't resell things, and there are limits on technology transfers, and it all becomes big, bureaucratic, complicated, expensive, and your product's more expensive. So why would I buy an ITAR incumbent product? So that's one consideration. Now, our legislation goes well beyond ITAR because essentially it doesn't have the ITAR or the UK exemptions. So the end result of that is inevitably you cannot have a lower compliance cost if more things are regulated. On top of it, we've got this issue because of the lack of exemptions of a cascade effect, okay, which I talked about in the slides. And the way the cascade effect works is, of course, is if you've got something that can be used to aid and assist in the development of this. Now, Tina talks about regulatory thresholds. The problem with regulatory thresholds, if they're not put into the law in the legislation, anybody can interpret them the way they please. Now, this was something I wanted to take up with Tina, but we ran out of time. Having worked in the military sector for 35 years and having done things like consulted to DSTO and friends in the United States, one of the things that I have learned is that Defence's expertise level within DSTO and across the organisation to perform the type of assessments and value judgments that are required to decide, does this really matter or not that strong. Yes, there are some strong people in some parts of DSTO, but they've been losing a lot of them. A lot of people have gone to the universities. The problem with DSTO, it's too small, too narrow. Under the US ITAR system, for instance, if I want to publish a paper that's in a sensitive area, and this is an issue I have just not seen addressed either by Chubb's group or otherwise, is having a formal review cycle to permit release and disclosures. Now, how this works under ITAR is that there are nominated organisations that are allowed to do reviews. These are places like MIT Lincoln Lab, Georgia Tech, in other words, secure de facto military labs attached to universities or military research establishments. Examples might be Sandia Labs or otherwise, that are doing cutting edge work where you've got people who are genuinely expert in that area you might be working in. So if you are in industry or you are in a university and you want to write about something that's ITAR covered, you have had access to ITAR technology. What you can do is you submit your paper. By law, and this is part of the ITAR legislation, the government is obliged in 6 weeks to come back to you and say yes or no, or maybe, or change this or change that. Now, there are lots of anecdotes circulating in the US system that I've heard from a lot of friends in the US about things going wrong in ITAR. A classic is one colleague said to me, he submitted a paper. The reviewer said, you've got, I think, 12 breaches in it. You've got to remove those. If you don't remove those, you can't publish the paper. He then went through each and every breach and gave the reviewer a copy of an existing public paper that referred to that. So the model that is used essentially in doing ITAR assessments is, does the enemy know it? Okay, and this goes back to the COCOM thing. One of the problems with DTCA, I have, for instance, done a lot, certainly in the last 15 years, forensic comparative analysis. I will look at a Russian weapon or a Chinese weapon and I will pull it apart, well, it used to be on paper, do modelling of its performance, do modelling of its capabilities, establish how dangerous is it, what can they do with it. This has been highly valued research work in the United States. It's problematic in Australia partly because of ERA, but more so now with DTCA. You just can't do it because the nature of what it is, because of the lack of academic exemptions, it's street legal in the USA, just makes it illegal. And knowing from long arguments with the Defence Department at a very senior level that I've been having with them for 15 years, they don't like this stuff being published in Australia because very often people will look at it and say, well, if this piece of foreign equipment is that good, why are we buying junk? Now, I have sat in parliamentary committee rooms while senior defence figures and our think tank have basically ended up going through tit-for-tat cycles of argument about this. So the Defence Department as an organisation does not like public discourse on matters of military technology, in part because they themselves, in my experience, have, by global standards, a very low skills base in that area. There's some expertise in DSTO, but generally the organisation is very, very weak.
Carlo, thank you for the sermon. It's very entertaining, but I would like to canvass for more questions.
All right.
Yeah.
May I ask, recently on the news, there were ISP being ordered to reveal the names of all those people illegally downloading. And I think personally is wrong, because the internet is so freely accessible. In that case, if you want people to pay, you make the technologically, people have to pay before they can download. So they really can't blame all these people. And I heard over the radio, the mother nervous about children, downloading so easily. So I think somehow, this case should be thrown out. I think so. I hope the academics people in the legal profession should work together to throw this out, because it was their own being naive in not being technologically being able to restrict people from downloading. You just look at all those banks we have to access with the.
I'm quite sure that's a question not for Chris Brown, so I'll direct that to Greg Adamson, since he's the SSIT representative here.
The difficulty we've got here is that the internet wasn't designed to protect intellectual property. The World Wide Web was not designed. If you go to the World Wide Web design specifications that Tim Berners-Lee prepared in 1989 under intellectual property and security, he said not required. So by design, the internet is not secure. By design, the internet is not business friendly. How the difficulty we have here is that I don't want to be offensive or objectionable, but North Korea has an active IT sector. They actively go out and promote their IT services. You can buy cloud computing services in North Korea, and they're quite financially competitive. So if the government regulation in Australia allows us to locate key information in a server in North Korea, but prevents us from exchanging it with a research collaborator somewhere else in the world, I don't think this has been designed to protect Australian security. I think it's been designed to control discourse, and that's what I find a bit worrying.
I'm happy to provide a comment.
That was directed at you, I think.
So I'm undertaking a procurement process at the moment for a particular project. One of the things that I will look at as part of that is what are the risks, who wants to do it, how do they want to do it. It's to partner with an international organisation. I would think anyone who was dealing with anything of any measure of sensitivity and was chose a North Korean supplier probably didn't have a very good risk management plan. Would be, and I can't, nor can defence regulate against idiocy, because that would, if it was sensitive.
I don't have a clue. I just
And ultimately, one of the problems with this whole cloud computing model is you might be using provider X's cloud, they might be outsourcing it anywhere globally.
Yep.
And generally, by law, they are not required to disclose who they are outsourcing to. So it could be, a server farm somewhere in China or the Bahamas or wherever.
But if it's particularly, I'm talking about particularly sensitive information that you may have. I know our department in the way it manages IT, and I think we're looking at the cloud now. They'll be looking at, well, who is actually going to provide it and where would it be going? I mean, our biggest risk as a department is hacking. It's not uncommon for our servers to go down, and so IT security for our department is particularly important. And so that'll be a major consideration.
Problem now, because you can end up with spyware and malware. Now, there's a lot of stuff recently about the NSA actually getting bootable modules into disk drive firmware during manufacture and successfully using this to penetrate all these other countries. Now, all right, I won't get into the ethics of that or otherwise. That's intelligence, active intelligence collection and penetration. But there's a bigger and broader problem is that you buy any piece of equipment, you don't know what malware might be embedded in it if you're buying it from a foreign country. The other thing is, if you're buying an imported product, unless you pull it apart, which typically breaks your warranty,
you don't know what parts were put into it and where they were sourced from. And this has just been an ongoing issue in a whole bunch of areas. US defence contracting, it's been a huge headache. Chinese parts that have been labelled as if they were manufactured elsewhere, ending up in military equipment manufactured in the United States. Okay, so QED. So,
look, the reality is, if there was no way to get around the law, we wouldn't have prisons. Right? So this is not a foolproof measure. Right? Things are going to happen. Things are going to be circumvented. You know, the intent of this law, as I understand it, is to prevent malicious actors, people who are actively and deliberately attempting to
the question I would ask is, why are we going so far beyond what our colleagues and allies in the United States and other Western nations are? Because certainly my assessment is, and having looked at the Soviet regime and the Russian regime, and you know, and I read, look, I've got a bunch of declassified, off the web Russian engineering technical manuals for guided missiles and radars. You could reverse engineer one from that. Okay, there is so much stuff out there in the public domain now. The way this legislation is written, all it takes is for some eager bureaucrat in decode to make a mistake, assume that something's not on the web, you can end up in court, okay, despite the fact then you have to prove that it was, you know, a posteriori. Now, ITAR has protections against that. I had an interesting approach about 3 months ago. A prosecutor in New York, federal, wanted to engage me as an expert witness in an ITAR violation case. Now, I declined, primarily because it wasn't quite my area, but the punchline here with this type of stuff is that you really only need to control what matters. This legislation controls a vast number of things that in real military terms just do not matter. Okay?
Can I just add? So
okay. Just on that point, it's not just military though. So if you have a look at some of the crop diseases that they're controlled, they're subject to control, which is why plant biosecurity was one of the pilots.
Yeah.
There's economic sabotage as well.
Yes, so, but look, ultimately that all falls under the domain of warfare. Really, this is the whole intent of these regulatory regimes, whether you look at Wassenaar, whether you look at ITAR, whether you look at the preceding COCOM, it's people that want to cause damage and mayhem, not allowing them to easily tap into things that allow them to build weapons.
Well, that's the intent, but DSGL and DTCA are sweeping up a huge number of other kinds of research that, like you say, have nothing to do with military. That's the problem.
There's been long-running arguments about the appropriateness of ITAR. There are a lot of people in America that want to change ITAR because it's considered far too expensive, far too restrictive. My assessment is that the problem with ITAR, it is assumed that you know what the enemy knows. Now that was true during the Cold War where we had one enemy. It was a bipolar world. Today, who could we count as our enemies or potential enemies? Depending on how paranoid you are, there could be dozens of them. Okay? But realistically, in strategic military terms, we are in a strategic competitive relationship with China, whether we like it or not. Russia is currently in the process of converting itself into a not just authoritarian, but quasi-Soviet type of regime. Okay? We have North Korea, we have Iran, the axis of evil regimes. Then you've got a whole bunch of other players who will proliferate anything they can make a buck on. Okay? So you have a whole bunch of problems around, I suppose you would say, major strategic players that will often steal and hack whatever they can just to advance their own military weapons programs for head-to-head military strategic competition. Then you've got a bunch of other players out there, whether they are non-state actors or state actors, who are simply in it for a quid.
So ITAR protects the United States from the Soviet Union still, at considerable expense to the United States, and DTCA and DSGL are even worse, protecting us from God knows what.
Well, the big question here that I have, and I have never been able to get a straight answer out of anybody in defence, and my colleague, the APA think tank, Peter Green, he's spoken to people in defence, he's not been able to get any straight answers out of them as to what the actual regulatory intent of this is. I do know that defence like to suppress public discourse when it involves criticisms of defence. How do I know that? Editors I have written for, whether in the Financial Review or in the trade press, have had irate phone calls from people in defence making very abusive comments.
Actually, you know that because they're human. No human likes critical discourse.
And the question is always, did he say anything, did Carlo say anything that was classified or controlled? No. Did Carlo say anything that was untrue? No. Why are you complaining? Okay? So there is a problem here with, I suppose you would describe it, a hyper thin-skinned bureaucracy in defence. Now the cause for this is you can go back and look at Craig Orme's Pathways to Change document. It was published in 2010. The primary ethical imperative is to protect the organisation's reputation. Okay? That actually, that's in black and smudge. Okay? There are other things in there that I won't talk about that are of deep concern.
But look, your grievances are fine, but I think,
right.
If we come back to the purpose of the forum, that'd be appreciated.
So if I could just...
Yes.
So I'm just looking at this sort of from an outsider's view, and I don't have experience with your department. I have experience with DPIE when it was trying to figure out whether to make economic things military and stuff like that in the 90s. To hold them under the same controls. But what we've seen in the last few months, we've seen a threat from the government saying, if the Senate keeps on misperforming, we're going to sack 1,700 scientists. And now we seem to be, if these terrorists don't stop terrorising people, we're going to punish Australian researchers. And it just doesn't seem to, it doesn't seem to connect. Doesn't make sense.
But that's not fit for purpose. Right.
That's why we have the steering group, and it's why we have our department involved. We're working. I mean, as I said, I've been in sort of this area within government for quite some time in science and research, and the steering group is a pretty impressive group in terms of the level of commitment and dedication they have to working to get this right and listening to stakeholders' concerns. So the steering group made a conscious decision at its last meeting. Do we want to continue? Do we want to make sure that we continue to provide a level of oversight so that we can work with the research sector and with industry and make sure that we're not breaking the system? So that's pretty rare. Normally they'd say, right, job's done, and they'd walk away. So the key thing is
that in fact the law is not fit for purpose.
Well, I think you need to...
Fair enough that they recognise that, but I think the action needs to be a little bit more dramatic than simply maintaining a steering group for another year and then disbanding and hoping that Senate takes over oversight.
But it's one thing to write a piece of legislation. The implementation, which is the phase we're entering into over the next 12 months, and oversight of that implementation, making sure that that what the steering group thinks was going to happen based on the legislation actually happens. Mm-hmm. And one of the discussions was, well, what if we find in 6 months' time that, gee, you know what, maybe there's a critical flaw in there somewhere. What do we do about it? Can an amendment be made? The reality is yes. I mean, the steering group provides independent advice to government, and so it can recommend further changes to legislation between now and the end of the 12-month transition period.
Or indeed afterwards.
Or indeed
amendments
afterwards.
are always possible.
Yes.
So I would like to make one point here that there's been lots of things that have gone past us rather quickly because there is so little time actually, but about the pilot programs. You had 7 or 8 pilot projects. 2 of them were universities. And as to the adequacy and thoroughness of those pilot projects, I have considerable doubt. UQ in particular, I know a researcher in high performance computing whose his whole life is research into matters which are now going to be directly regulated by DTCA. And his interaction at the UQ pilot program was zilch. He didn't even know about it until I told him that he was in a pilot program. So that's how thorough and effective this pilot investigation of impact has been, as far as I'm concerned. Zilch.
I'll take your opinion as a comment.
Fair enough. Now, I do understand that some disciplines were monitored in the pilot program at UQ. It just didn't happen to include computer science, which is about half of what the DSGL covers in dual use. A minor oversight.
While they weren't formally involved in the pilot program, the consultation engagement that's been undertaken has been extensive. We've had conversations with NICTA, we've met with the supercomputer guys at the ANU, and so we haven't ignored certain areas.
Okay, I accept that.
We just haven't necessarily
you've been consulting with various stakeholders, and that there were two very high-level administrative academics on the steering group board. I accept all of that. I don't accept that as being a thorough investigation of the likely impact on society of this legislation. I think that's highly deficient. I think the claim to have wide stakeholder support that Chubb has made is highly dubious.
To put this in context.
Kevin, it's 6:15 now,
Yes.
which is
Right time.
when we said we'd go to.
Indeed.
I've got to dash off now, but if you wanted to organise people to continue an informal discussion, that may be useful.
Okay.
I really, really appreciate you just being here and participating in this. I understand you may feel like you're under a lot of pressure here. But
like I said, this is nothing compared to talking to unsuccessful CRC applicants.
Okay, fair enough. I should be applying for a CRC immediately. Okay, so I want to thank Chris and Tina, who's no longer here, and Greg, and everyone for showing up. It's been an interesting event. And anyone who wants to, I don't know, follow me to a pub or something, we can continue to argue with Chris if he's willing to come along.
So I have some business cards if anyone would like any of them.
Okay, thank you all.
Sure.
Cheers.